Chapter 4: A Lifeline in the Cold. Let us talk for a moment about freezing to death. Not the poetic, peaceful, drifting off to sleep in a snowbank kind of freezing to death that you see in 19th century romantic novels. I am talking about the violent, panic-inducing, physically catastrophic experience of plunging into the North Atlantic Ocean in the dead of winter. Picture where we are. We are on the deck of a wooden commercial fishing vessel in the late 1800s. We are hovering somewhere off the craggy, wind-battered coast of Yorkshire, or perhaps the unforgiving, black-sand shores of Iceland. The wind is howling like a wounded animal. The deck is slick with a gruesome slurry of fish guts and freezing sea spray. And the water churning violently beneath the hull is hovering somewhere around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 10 degrees Celsius. You are exhausted, you are cold, and in a momentary lapse of footing, you slip. You pitch backward over the wooden rail, you hit the water. What happens next is an absolute masterclass in human biological failure. Unless you are wearing some form of high-tech thermal protection, which, spoiler alert, you are not, because it is the 19th century, cold water immersion is immediately, violently life-threatening. You do not have a leisurely hour to calmly tread water, assess your situation, and wait for your crewmates to toss you a thick rope. You do not even have 20 minutes. When your warm mammalian body hits 50-degree water, you experience an immediate physiological crisis that maritime safety experts affectionately refer to as cold shock. Your body's immediate, involuntary, hardwired response to this sudden temperature drop is to gasp. This is a phenomenally terrible reflex to have when you are suddenly submerged in a churning ocean. You hyperventilate. Your heart rate and your blood pressure spike so dramatically that your cardiovascular system practically redlines, screaming under the sudden workload. If your face happens to be underwater when that uncontrollable gasp reflex hits, you will inhale a massive lungful of freezing seawater and drown right there in the first 30 seconds of your ordeal. But let us be optimistic. Let us say you manage to keep your head above the chaotic surface of the waves. Congratulations are in order. You have successfully survived Stage 1. Now you get to enter Stage 2, cold incapacitation. Within 10 to 15 minutes of bobbing in the North Atlantic, the blood vessels in your arms and legs begin to constrict violently. This is your body desperately trying to keep your vital organs, your heart, your lungs, your brain, warm by ruthlessly sacrificing your extremities. You rapidly lose all manual dexterity. Your fingers turn into useless, numb, freezing claws. You could have a cork life preserver floating 2 feet away from your face, and your hands simply would not be able to grip the ropes. Even if you happen to be a remarkably strong swimmer, your muscles will refuse to fire. You will lose the ability to tread water, and you will begin to sink beneath the surface. If you somehow manage to stay afloat, perhaps you are wedged against a floating barrel or some debris from the ship. Stage 3 sets in. This is actual, clinical hypothermia, defined as the point where your core body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. At first, your body begins to shiver violently, your muscles firing rapidly in a desperate, microscopic effort to generate friction and heat. But then, as your core temperature drops closer to 82 degrees, the shivering stops entirely. Your muscles go horrifyingly rigid. Your brain, starved of warmth and properly oxygenated blood, stops making sense of the world. People in this advanced stage of hypothermia often become profoundly confused. Their speech slurs, they hallucinate, and then they may experience paradoxical undressing. This is a bizarre, morbid phenomenon where the freezing brain, misfiring wildly, suddenly decides that the body is actually overheating. The blood vessels that were previously clamped shut suddenly dilate, creating a false, burning sensation of extreme heat. The freezing victim will desperately try to tear off their clothes before slipping completely into unconsciousness. Finally, even if a miracle occurs and you are pulled from the water by your crewmates, you are not out of the woods. You might still die from post-rescue collapse. This is a terrifying afterdrop, where the freezing, acidic blood from your previously isolated limbs suddenly rushes back to your heart as you begin to warm up, triggering fatal cardiac arrest hours after you thought you were safe and sound. In water that cold, you have perhaps 1 to 3 hours before the brain and heart stop entirely, but you will be completely helpless and paralyzed long before the clock runs out. Now, keeping all of that grim biology in mind, I want to ask a very serious question. How on earth did anyone survive working on the frigid, unforgiving seas of the North Atlantic for the past several centuries? These men did not have thick neoprene wetsuits. They did not have modern Gore-Tex dry suits. They did not have base layers engineered by scientists in high-tech laboratories out of synthetic fleece. They had sheep hair. Specifically, they had highly engineered, tightly knitted garments made entirely from the unwashed fleece of local sheep. It seems almost absurd, a cosmic joke, that the razor-thin difference between life and death in one of the planet's most hostile marine environments came down to the domestic craft of knitting. But the deeper you look into the microscopic biology of wool and the astonishing structural geometry of historical knitting patterns, the more you realize that these garments were not merely clothing. They were not fashion. They were heavy, stiff, meticulously designed pieces of critical survival equipment. They were armor. The exothermic magic of the sheep. To truly understand how a knitted sweater can keep a sailor alive in a frozen gale, we have to look at the actual, fascinating science of wool. Why does sheep's wool keep you warm even when it is completely soaking wet? If you wear a beautiful cotton sweater into the ocean, you will freeze even faster than if you were swimming completely naked. If you wear a modern synthetic polyester jacket out in the freezing rain, it will eventually lose its insulating ability, flattening out and feeling cold, slick, and clammy against your skin. But wool is entirely different. Wool is a biological magic trick. Let us zoom in and break down the anatomy of a single, solitary strand of wool. The absolute center of the fiber is called the pith, and this pith is surrounded by a cortex made largely of a protein called keratin. Keratin, if you are curious, is the exact same tough protein that makes up your hair, your fingernails, and the horns of a rhinoceros. The outer surface of the wool fiber is composed of microscopic cuticles, which look essentially like overlapping, jagged scales. These scales can actually open and close depending on the climatic conditions, giving wool its extraordinary strength, flexibility, and durability. But the real superpower of the wool fiber lies in its bizarre, highly sophisticated relationship with water. Wool manages moisture in 3 distinct phases. First, it has an incredible capacity for vapor phase absorption. Unlike synthetic fibers, such as nylon or polyester, which simply repel water or wick sweat along the surface so it can evaporate, the keratin proteins in wool possess millions of microscopic pores. These pores literally pull water vapor right into the core of the fiber itself. This process is scientifically known as adsorption. That is adsorption with a D, not absorption with a B, and the difference is critically important. When a kitchen sponge soaks up a spill on your counter, that is absorption. The water permeates the whole structure of the sponge and makes it physically wet to the touch. But when wool takes in water, it is adsorption. The water molecules become trapped internally within the naturally porous fibers, binding chemically to the internal amino acid structures, while the outer, scaly surface of the fiber remains completely dry to the touch. This is the exact reason why a wool garment can adsorb up to an astonishing 35% of its own dry weight in water, without actually feeling wet or clammy against your skin. But here is where the biology gets truly wild. When those water molecules enter the wool fiber and bond with the polar amino acid groups inside the cortex, groups like carboxyl and hydroxyl structures, a chemical reaction occurs. Specifically, it is an exothermic reaction. If you remember your high school chemistry classes, an exothermic reaction is one that actively releases heat. Inside the microscopic environment of the wool fibers, as the hydrogen bonds of the incoming water molecules break down and bind to the chemical structure of the keratin, they literally generate thermal energy. Yes, you heard that correctly. When wool gets wet, it actually generates its own heat. This phenomenon is known as the heat absorption. Way back in 1858, a French scientist named Caulier was the very first person to formally observe this. He noted that when perfectly dry wool was moved into a humid, cold environment and began to absorb water vapor, it produced small but highly significant amounts of thermal energy. Modern experiments have quantified Cowlier's findings with precise measurements. When water bonds with wool, it releases exactly 1.1 kilojoules of heat energy per gram of moisture absorbed. To put that mathematical abstract into a perspective you can feel, consider this. If you take 1 single kilogram of perfectly dry merino wool and place it into a cold, damp, highly humid atmosphere, the chemical reaction of that wool absorbing the surrounding moisture will release about the exact same amount of heat as a standard electric blanket running on high for 8 solid hours. A sheep is, essentially, a walking exothermic reactor. For a 19th century fisherman caught in the freezing, relentless sea spray of a North Atlantic squall, this biological quirk was a literal lifesaver. As the freezing fog and the wet sea air hit his heavily knitted sweater, the porous wool actively pulled the moisture into its core, triggering the exothermic reaction and actively baking the man in a microclimate of trapped, generated heat. And because wool fibers have natural kinks, bends, and crimps in their cellular structure, they create millions of tiny pockets of trapped, dead air. Since still air is a remarkably poor conductor of heat, these millions of microscopic pockets act as a thermal vault. They lock the body's natural warmth inside the garment, while the exothermic reaction runs silently in the background. Even in extreme, miserable conditions hovering around 5 degrees Celsius, a damp wool base layer can maintain a stable, cozy microclimate next to the human skin of 32 to 35 degrees Celsius. This drastically reduces the body's need to shiver, saving precious calories and staving off the horrors of hypothermia. But the thermal physics of sheep keratin is only half the story. To fully appreciate the fisherman's armor, we also have to talk about the grease. Lanolin, the miracle grease. If you have ever had the rare opportunity to plunge your bare hands deeply into a freshly shorn sheep's fleece, straight off the animal, you will immediately notice 2 incredibly distinct things. First, the smell. It is a highly pungent, incredibly earthy, distinctly barnyard odor. Some avid knitters find the smell deeply comforting and intoxicating, while others wrinkle their noses in pure disgust and run for the nearest bar of soap. It smells like an animal. It smells alive. Second, as you pull your hands out of the fleece, you will find them coated in a thick, heavy, waxy, lotion-like grime. This substance is lanolin, though it is often more bluntly referred to simply as wool wax or wool grease. Lanolin is a highly complex chemical mixture secreted by the sebaceous glands of the sheep, entirely designed by nature to protect the animal from the unforgiving environment. Its primary biological job is to act as a heavy-duty, impenetrable waterproofing agent, keeping the sheep's delicate skin dry and insulated against freezing rain and snow. But lanolin also happens to be a natural antimicrobial marvel. The surface of wool fibers contains specialized fatty acids that, when combined with the lanolin, create a slightly acidic microenvironment. Bacteria, particularly the kinds of bacteria that cause horrible body odor, absolutely hate this slightly acidic environment. They find it incredibly difficult to thrive or multiply. This is precisely why heavy wool garments can be worn by sweating, filthy men for weeks or even months at a time without developing a horrific, unbearable stench. In the modern commercial yarn industry, raw wool undergoes a brutal, highly mechanized scouring process before it ever reaches a craft store. The raw fleece is passed through a series of chemical washing trains to completely strip out the accumulated farm dirt, the dried sheep sweat, and all of the natural lanolin. Clean, heavily scoured wool is incredibly fluffy, lightweight, and very easy to dye in bright, attractive colors. But early knitters living in isolated coastal fishing communities knew vastly better than to wash away the magic. They intentionally spun their yarn in the grease, meaning they left the natural, heavy lanolin entirely intact within the fibers. Knitting a garment with heavily greasy wool is a highly visceral, incredibly sensory experience. As you work the thick yarn rapidly through your fingers, the natural heat of your hands actively softens the lanolin. It feels almost exactly as though you are constantly rubbing a heavy, slightly sticky, luxurious moisturizer directly into your skin. The finished knitted garment is significantly heavier, incredibly dense, and visibly slicker than the soft, fluffy modern sweaters you might find at a department store. And it smells. Oh, does it ever smell? When the lanolin-rich wool gets damp from the sea air, it releases that intensely pungent, unmistakable odor of wet sheep. But to a freezing fisherman working a net on the violent North Sea, that powerful barnyard smell was the literal smell of survival. The heavy lanolin coated the outside of every single knitted stitch, effectively creating a natural, impenetrable rain slicker. When massive, violent waves crashed over the bow of the wooden boat, soaking the crew, the freezing saltwater would simply beat up and roll harmlessly off the lanolin-coated exterior of the wool. Meanwhile, the inner cortex of the fiber aggressively adsorbed whatever water vapor managed to sneak through the greasy barrier, simultaneously generating that life-saving exothermic heat. It was a perfect, naturally engineered dual-action survival system. Geography as destiny, the knitting compulsion. If you look at a topographical map of the world and trace your finger across the craggy, wind-blasted, isolated archipelagos of the North Atlantic, the British Isles, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and the rocky coasts of Scandinavia, you will find a unique geographical zone. In these places, knitting was never considered a quaint, gentle, gendered hobby to pass the time comfortably by the fire. It was a compulsory, massive, relentless industrial engine of survival. In these brutal climates, geography was destiny. The unforgiving landscape dictated a simple rule. If you wanted to eat, and if you wanted to not freeze to death during the long, dark winters, you knit. Everyone knit, it was not a choice. Let us look closely at Iceland. When the seafaring Vikings first arrived to colonize Iceland in the year 874, they brought with them a particularly hardy breed of Scandinavian sheep. Historians are quite clear on this point. Without these specific sheep, the human colonization of Iceland would have failed completely and miserably. The animals provided the crucial meat required to survive the inevitable famines, and the wool required to survive the lethal, sunless winters. For centuries, Icelandic textiles were primarily woven on massive, incredibly heavy warp-weighted looms. And if you believe the more morbid, highly dramatic Viking sagas of the era, these looms were occasionally depicted in horrifying mythological visions. One saga describes terrifying spectral women riding on horseback, engaging in a weaving process on a warp-weighted loom where they used human intestines as the threading yarn, an arrow as the shuttle, and actual human skulls as the heavy stones to weight the bottom of the loom. They wove the grisly fabric of human fate, tearing it apart to influence the bloody outcome of distant battles. It is a delightfully macabre image, perfectly capturing the brutal, life-or-death nature of early Icelandic textile production. But by the early 16th century, the technology of knitting finally arrived in Iceland, likely introduced by traveling English or Dutch merchants, and it swept the isolated island like a fever. Because the act of knitting required absolutely nothing more than some spun wool and a set of thin needles. No massive wooden looms, no dedicated floor space in tiny turf houses. It was the ultimate, democratic survival tool. Suddenly, even the absolute poorest citizens, the desperate outlaws hiding in the hills, and the laborers living on the absolute fringes of the habitable land could produce high-quality textiles. And produce they did. Historical documents recovered from the 1600s show that the population of Iceland, which was incredibly small, hovering at only around 50,000 people at the time, was somehow churning out and exporting hundreds of thousands of knitted sweaters, socks, and mittens every single year. Think for a moment about the sheer, mind-numbing physical toll of that kind of manual production. Nearly 20% of the entire population of Iceland worked exclusively in the wool trade during the long, dark winter months. Women were strictly expected to churn out an entire pair of long socks in a single day, or to knit 4 complete sweaters every single week. And it was absolutely not just women. Children had strict, unyielding knitting quotas they were forced to meet. A very small child was fully expected to complete a pair of complex, two-thumbed fishermen's mittens every single week. In Iceland, it was a common joke that children were taught to knit as soon as they learned how to crawl. And the people did not just sit at home in a rocking chair to do this work. They knitted continuously while actively herding violent, stubborn sheep. They knitted while walking miles from one isolated farm to another. Their hands flew on autopilot, muscles memorizing the stitches, while they navigated the freezing, treacherous tundra. The volume and pace of the knitting was so intense, and so physically damaging to the hands, that the workers actually wore special protective thimbles crafted out of raw sheepskin, just to prevent their fingers from blistering, cracking, and bleeding from the constant, relentless friction of the rough yarn and the thin metal needles. During the long, pitch-black winter evenings, Icelandic households observed a tradition called the kvöldvakt, which translates essentially to the evening wake. The entire household, men, women, and children alike, would gather closely together in the main room of the turf house. One person would read aloud from the ancient, violent sagas, while every single other person sat in the dim, smoky light, carding wool, spinning yarn, and knitting furiously. Knitting was so deeply baked into the romantic culture of the island that a young suitor might spend weeks carving an elaborate, highly decorated wooden knitting needle case to present to the woman he was aggressively courting. The situation was somehow even more extreme in the Faroe Islands. The Faroes are a tiny, dramatically wind-battered archipelago located roughly halfway between Norway and Iceland. The Faroese people have an incredibly accurate old saying, "Wool is Faroe gold." In the 17th and 18th centuries, the total population of the Faroe Islands hovered steadily below 5,000 people. Yet, incredibly, this tiny, isolated handful of humans was reliably exporting hundreds of thousands of pairs of knitted woolen stockings every single year. In fact, knitted stockings literally became the primary currency of the islands. Rent to landlords and taxes to the crown were paid directly in white and brown knitted stockings. In 1584, the Faroese parliament actually had to hold a highly serious governmental session specifically to fix the economic exchange rate of knitwear, officially deciding that a single pair of brown stockings was worth exactly 5 animal hides. When the highly efficient Scottish spinning wheel was finally introduced to the islands in the late 1600s, stocking production skyrocketed to such an absurd, completely unsustainable degree that the Faroese literally crashed the entire European stocking market. The islanders were knitting so relentlessly, producing goods at such a terrifying speed, that by 1683, economic experts estimated it would take 3 solid years just to sell one single year's supply of their hosiery. Massive piles of unsold woolen stockings sat rotting in giant Copenhagen storehouses, eventually becoming so deeply infested with ravenous moths that a staggering 177,000 pairs of stockings had to be taken out into the streets and destroyed. Yet the Faroese simply kept knitting. The wealthy landowners found the export of knitted goods so incredibly, undeniably profitable that they actually altered the local laws to bar landless couples from getting married until they had served on a farm for 4 long years, essentially forcing the romantic youth into a state of indentured knitting labor. The fisherman's armor, engineering the gansie. As the centuries rolled on, the intense focus of the coastal knitting industry slowly shifted from producing endless mountains of hosiery to engineering heavy, highly protective upper body garments. If you were a fisherman heading out into the lethal waters of the North Sea in the 19th century, your life depended completely on one very specific piece of equipment, the gansie. That is pronounced Guernsey for the uninitiated. The gansie, occasionally called a guernsey, was the ultimate, uncompromising utilitarian workman's garment, deeply popular among British and Scottish fishing fleets from the late 19th to the early 20th century. We casually call it a sweater today, but applying that word to a gansie is a profound insult. The word sweater implies something soft, fuzzy, and comfortable that you might wear to a corner cafe on a brisk autumn day while sipping a latte. The historical gansie was none of those things. It was a dense, incredibly heavy, nearly rigid piece of architectural engineering. It was knitted from tightly spun worsted wool, often dyed a deep, dark indigo blue, and it was constructed laboriously using 5 thin, double-pointed metal needles. The defining, absolute genius of the Gansi is its seamless construction. Unlike traditional, modern sweaters, which are knitted flat in separate panels, a front piece, a back piece, and 2 flat sleeves, and then sewn together at the seams, the Gansi is knitted in the round. It is constructed as one continuous, unbroken tube of 3-dimensional fabric. Why does this matter so much? Because of the unforgiving physics of thermal bridging. When you sew 2 separate pieces of thick insulation together, the tight tension of the sewing thread severely compresses the material at the seam line. This compression effectively destroys the 3-dimensional structure of the fabric, squeezing out all the trapped, insulating air pockets at the point of the stitch. Since dead air is the primary insulator in any garment, these flattened, highly compressed seams become thermal bridges. They act as literal superhighways for vital body heat to escape outward, and for freezing, biting wind to aggressively enter inward. By knitting the entire Gansi in a continuous, unbroken round, the brilliant women of the fishing villages eliminated these seams entirely. They effectively created what modern, high-tech garment technologists refer to as spacer stitching, but on a macro, garment-wide level. They preserved the high loft of the wool and maintained a continuous, completely uninterrupted barrier of trapped, warm, exothermically generated air all the way around the fisherman's vulnerable torso. Every single detail of the Gansi was dictated by the brutal, physically demanding realities of hauling heavy, wet nets on a violently pitching boat. The fit of the garment was incredibly tight, bordering on highly restrictive. This was explicitly designed so that the excess fabric would not snag on deadly fishing hooks or heavy, moving winches, and so the sweater would not act as a heavy, waterlogged anchor and be easily washed off if the unfortunate wearer fell into the raging ocean. To compensate for this extreme tightness, and to allow the fishermen the necessary mobility to raise their arms high to haul the heavy nets, the knitters engineered brilliant, diamond-shaped pieces of extra fabric, called gussets, directly into the underarms. These gussets acted precisely like expansion joints on a steel bridge, allowing free movement without sacrificing the tight, protective fit. The neckline was designed as a tight, high stand-up collar to aggressively block the freezing wind from creeping down the back, and the lower body featured a split hem to allow the rigid garment to sit comfortably over bulky, waterproof outer trousers. Even the sleeves were perfectly optimized for the disgusting nature of the job. They were intentionally knitted short, stopping well above the wrist, specifically to prevent the cuffs from constantly dragging in freezing seawater, coagulating fish blood, and slippery eel slime. Because the lower sleeves inevitably saw the most extreme friction and abuse from constantly rubbing against the wooden gunnels of the boat, they were left completely plain, totally devoid of any intricate or decorative patterning. When the cuffs eventually frayed, rotted away, or became completely destroyed, the knitter could simply unravel the lower section of the sleeve, pick up the live loops of yarn, and reknit a completely fresh cuff directly onto the old sweater without having to replace the entire precious garment. The upper half of the Gansi, however, was a completely different story. Across the chest and the upper arms, the knitters employed incredibly complex, heavily textured stitch patterns. They meticulously alternated knits and purls to create elaborate zigzags, repeating diamonds, thick ropes, and grids. This was absolutely not merely decorative fashion. The dense texture actively created a much thicker fabric with even more trapped air pockets, effectively double insulating the fisherman's vital organs, his heart and lungs, against the biting, lethal wind. Which brings us, inevitably, to one of the most famous, most darkly morbid, and most entirely fabricated myths in the entire history of textiles. The morbid myth of the drowned man. If you have ever bought a thick, white, heavily cabled sweater from a quaint tourist shop in Ireland, you have almost certainly been told the legend. The famous story goes that these incredibly heavy sweaters, specifically the Aran sweater, pronounced Aran, named after a cluster of beautifully unforgiving islands off the west coast of Ireland, have been worn by rugged, stoic fishermen for thousands of years. The myth claims with absolute sincerity that every coastal village, or even every specific fishing family, had its own unique, highly guarded, intensely secret knitting pattern. And the reason for these distinct, familial patterns was deeply grim. The lore states that if a fisherman's boat went down in a violent storm, and his bloated, battered, unrecognizable corpse washed up on a rocky beach 3 weeks later, his face would be entirely gone. The only possible way the grieving widow could positively identify her dead husband's mangled remains was by looking at the specific, family-coded cable-knit pattern of the sweater encasing his chest. It is a truly fantastic story. It is deeply romantic, it is undeniably goth, it pulls at the heartstrings, and it makes for incredibly lucrative marketing copy when selling expensive wool to American tourists. It is also absolute, complete garbage. Let us start by looking at the highly practical, deeply biological reality of a drowned body left in the ocean. The North Atlantic is not a gentle, respectful resting place. If a man drowns in a raging squall and his body is battered against the rocks for weeks, the violent, churning action of the waves, the grinding stones, and the hungry, opportunistic marine scavengers do not treat a heavy wool sweater with delicate reverence. The sweater is going to be just as mangled as the body. But more importantly, let us look at the actual historical record, because the origin of this famous myth is a bizarre, hilarious tale of theatrical misunderstandings, commercial greed, and a Prussian anthropologist with a highly overactive imagination. First of all, there is virtually zero historical evidence of the heavily cabled, white Aran sweater even existing before the early 1900s. Up until the turn of the 20th century, the only historical evidence of any knitting occurring on the Aran Islands was the production of standard, highly boring wool stockings. When Aran fishermen actually went to sea in the 1800s, they did not wear heavy, brilliantly white, heavily cabled sweaters. Photographic evidence clearly shows they wore the standard, dark, tightly fitted British ganseys, which they likely simply bought from contract knitters on the mainland. The true, decidedly unromantic genesis of the Aran sweater can be traced back to 1891. A government body called the Congested Districts Board stepped in to help stimulate the deeply impoverished, failing economy of the Aran Islands. They brought in experienced, highly skilled female fish gutters from Scotland, colloquially known as the herring lasses, to teach the local Irish women how to process fish more efficiently. These Scottish women happened to be expert knitters, and they likely brought the advanced techniques of the Scottish gansey with them to the islands. The local Irish women absorbed these techniques, began experimenting with thicker, unwashed local wool, known as bonine, pronounced bawnine, and started knitting heavily patterned sweaters. But they were not making workwear for their husbands to bleed on. Research suggests they likely started making these elaborate, heavily patterned white sweaters as fancy communion garments for their young children. By the 1930s, as the hand-knitting industry realized there was serious money to be made selling these garments to wealthy tourists, the designs became deeply commercialized. The classic white color was favored simply because it showed off the intricate, beautiful shadows of the three-dimensional cables, vastly better than dark blue or gray yarn. So where did the dead body story come from? How did a child's communion sweater become the morbid toe tag of the sea? The literary seed of the myth was initially planted by the famous Irish playwright J.M. Synge in his 1904 play, Riders to the Sea. In the play, a drowned man is indeed identified by his poor sister through his knitting. But it is absolutely not a sweater. He is identified by a specific number of dropped stitches in a single, simple pair of wool stockings. Decades later, a self-styled, Prussian-born anthropologist and wildly enthusiastic promoter named Heinz Edgar Q stumbled upon a beautiful Aran sweater in a Dublin shop. Q was a man who never let boring historical facts get in the way of a highly profitable story. He unilaterally decided that the Aran sweater was an ancient, sacred Celtic artifact. In his 1971 book, The Sacred History of Knitting, He aggressively propagated the myth that the various stitches had deep, ancient symbolic meanings. The moss stitch, he claimed, represented an abundance of growth. The blackberry stitch represented nature. The honeycomb stitch represented luck and a good catch, and the cables represented the strong ropes of the fishermen. Q even notoriously and hilariously claimed that a highly stylized, illuminated figure drawn in the ancient Book of Kells, an artifact dating back to the year 800, was clearly wearing a knitted, cable-patterned catsuit, thus proving the Aran knitting tradition was centuries old. Spoiler alert for art historians. The figure in the manuscript is wearing standard woven cloth, or possibly, given the stylized art, nothing at all. It took the rigorous, deeply unglamorous historical detective work of knitting historian Alice Starmore to finally, permanently dismantle Q's crockpot history. Starmore went deep into the archives of the National Museum of Ireland, examined the actual historical garments, and definitively proved that the so-called ancient tradition was barely a century old. It was driven entirely by commercial considerations to appeal to tourists, not by the ancient ghosts of dead fishermen washing up on the rocks. Furthermore, the very idea of isolated, highly unique patterns for each individual village makes absolutely no sense given the transient reality of the fishing industry. Fishermen were highly mobile workers. They followed the massive shoals of herring up and down the coasts of Scotland, England, and Ireland for months at a time. The women who gutted the fish traveled right alongside them. If an avid knitter in Yorkshire saw a particularly handsome diamond pattern on the sweater of a visiting Scottish fisherman, she certainly did not respect a geographical copyright. She simply copied the pattern. Photographic records of single fishing crews standing together show a completely chaotic mix of totally different sweater patterns standing shoulder to shoulder. A pattern didn't belong to a town. It belonged to whoever happened to like the look of it that week. There is, however, one tiny, fascinating sliver of historical truth to the idea of knitting being used for identification. But it had absolutely nothing to do with identifying rotting corpses. It had everything to do with identifying thieves. A hand-knitted gansie represented weeks of backbreaking, eye-straining, relentless labor. They were highly valuable pieces of essential equipment. Because rough fishermen lived in incredibly close, cramped quarters on boats and in cheap lodging houses, theft of a warm sweater was a very real, constant problem. To ensure their husband or son actually came home with the precise sweater they had spent a month knitting, many women would secretly knit the man's initials directly into the hem of the sweater. This was usually done in a subtle, barely noticeable combination of knit and purl stitches, located just above the welt or cleverly hidden deep under the arm in the gusset. In a fascinating 1979 book interviewing coastal residents about their history, an old fisherman recounted a brilliant story about his grandmother, who had knit a gansie for his Uncle Willie. Willie somehow lost the incredibly valuable sweater, and it was presumed stolen by a rival crew member. A full 12 months later, the grandmother saw another man casually walking down the street, wearing the sweater. She marched right up to him, furiously accused him of wearing her boy's jersey, and literally dragged a local policeman over to arrest the man in the street. When the highly skeptical policeman asked how she could possibly prove this generic, dark blue sweater was hers, she ordered the accused man to lift his arms in the air. She pointed triumphantly to the armpits. She had knit a subtle W into the left underarm gusset and an C into the right. Willie Steer's stolen sweater was promptly returned. Dust to dust, wool to the sea. So, if the fisherman did tragically meet a grim end in the freezing water, if the cold shock took him and the hypothermia shut down his heart, what actually happened to that indestructible, lanolin-soaked armor he was wearing? We know that modern synthetic garments, the brightly colored nylon windbreakers, the high-tech polyester fleeces, the advanced elastane base layers of today, will easily outlast the human body by centuries. They will sink to the bottom of the ocean and sit there, slowly shredding into microscopic, toxic plastics that will haunt the marine ecosystem and the ocean floor forever. But wool is biology. It is just hair. It is a part of the natural carbon cycle. In recent years, scientists at the Ag Research Institute conducted a series of fascinating, highly rigorous studies on the marine biodegradability of various modern textiles. They took samples of merino wool, both raw, untreated wool and modern machine-washable wool, and submerged them in active marine environments alongside samples of synthetic polyester and nylon. The synthetics, entirely predictably, just sat there in the water, doing absolutely nothing, refusing to break down. But the wool behaved exactly as nature intended. Within a matter of mere months, the microscopic marine microbes began to feast greedily on the keratin. The very scales and the thick cortex that once provided life-saving exothermic heat, the fibers that had stubbornly shielded the fishermen from the icy spray, broke down rapidly and completely. The wool dissolved back into the aquatic ecosystem without leaving a single trace of microplastic pollution behind. Even the modern hercoset resin used to make wool machine washable was proven not to leave toxic microplastics in the ocean. There is a strange, dark, incredibly beautiful poetry to this cycle. The heavy, greasy woolen Gansey was born entirely from the harsh, unforgiving landscape. It was grown slowly on the backs of stubborn sheep, grazing on salt-sprayed, rocky cliffs. It was sheared by hand, spun in the grease, and knit stitch by agonizing stitch by hands calloused from the cold. It lived its highly useful life out on the violent ocean, functioning flawlessly as a breathable, heat-generating, biological lung that kept the human heart beating just a little bit longer against truly impossible odds. And if the ocean eventually, inevitably claimed the man, it claimed the wool too, digesting it peacefully back into the wild, freezing water from which it earned its keep. So the very next time you pull on a thick wool sweater to brace against the winter wind, and you happen to notice that faint, distinctly earthy, slightly barnyard smell of lanolin wafting up toward your nose, remember exactly what you are wearing. You are not just wearing a piece of fashionable clothing. You are not just making a stylistic choice. You are wearing an ancient, highly engineered biological survival engine. You are wearing the lifeline in the cold.